The city was a restless beast, but within the concrete shell of the old apartment building, a peculiar stillness reigned. Anne, a woman of 27, with pragmatic eyes and a quiet determination, had sought refuge here not for the stillness, but for the affordable rent. Her new home was apartment 903, nestled on the ninth floor of a structure that had seen over 2 decades of city life ebb and flow around its weathered facade. She was an office worker, meticulously organized in her professional life, yet a novice when it came to deciphering the cryptic whispers of a new neighborhood. The building hummed with an aged energy, a mosaic of forgotten stories etched into its peeling paint and echoing stairwells, a stark contrast to the gleaming high-rises that now pierced the ever-growing skyline. Her decision to move in had been born of necessity, a quiet rebellion against the exorbitant cost of living in the bustling metropolis.
Apartment Chinsum-Chint was modest, its windows overlooking a patchwork of other aging rooftops, an indifferent urban landscape. There was a certain charm to its antiquated fixtures, a faint scent of lemon polish and dust clinging to the air, an ode to previous occupants. She had spent the better part of a Saturday arranging her sparse belongings, each book and framed photograph carefully placed, an attempt to infuse the unfamiliar space with a semblance of her own identity. Exhaustion had been her constant companion that day, a heavy cloak she'd willingly worn, eager to finally collapse into the soft embrace of her new, albeit temporary, bed. The first night in apartment Chinsum-Chint was, for the most part, uneventful. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant wail of a siren, the gentle creak of old pipes, these were the expected symphonies of urban dwelling. Anne had drifted into a light, shallow sleep, the kind that hovers on the precipice of awareness, easily disturbed.
Her mind, still buzzing from the day's labor, replayed snippets of conversations, to-do lists for the week ahead. She tossed, turned, her body slowly acclimatizing to the contours of a new mattress, the unfamiliar hush that settled over the building in the deepest hours of the night. Then it came. 3 distinct sounds, not a tremor from the floor above, nor the sharp rap of a branch against glass. No, these were deliberate, measured. A low, resonant knock, followed by another, a heartbeat later, knock, then finally a third, softer but equally insistent, knock. The sound was intimate, as if originating from just beyond her thin bedroom wall, though she knew it must be her front door. It cut through the quiet, a precise intrusion into the sacred space of her sleep. Her eyes snapped open. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed an ethereal green. 3 a.m. Precisely. A chill, unconnected to the room's temperature, traced a path down her spine. Who would be knocking at this hour? Confusion wrestled with a nascent unease. A neighbor in distress? A mistake? Her mind raced through improbable scenarios, dismissing each as quickly as it arose. No one knew she lived here yet, not truly. She was an anonymous newcomer in a building full of strangers. A shiver ran through her, but curiosity, stronger than caution in that half-waking state, compelled her to move. She swung her legs out of bed, the cool floor a sudden shock against her bare feet. Her heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She padded softly across the living room, her hand reaching for the doorknob. It was cold under her touch. A moment of hesitation, a faint whisper of instinct urging her to retreat, but the quiet of the apartment after the knocks felt heavy, expectant. With a slow, almost imperceptible click, the lock disengaged. She pulled the heavy door inward, just a crack at first, then wider, revealing the hallway beyond. Nothing. The long corridor stretched out, a cavern of stale air and muted shadows. The single fluorescent light fixture above flickered intermittently, casting an anemic glow that seemed to eat away at the corners of the space rather than illuminate it. It was darker than usual, Anne realized, an unnatural gloom clinging to the walls, absorbing what little light existed. A vast, empty expanse of beige wallpaper and closed doors. No one, not a soul. She peered left, then right, her gaze tracing the length of the silent hallway. Her breath hitched. The air felt heavy, thick with an unseen presence. And then she felt it, a prickling sensation at the nape of her neck, a certainty that someone or something had been there just moments before, or was still there, lurking. Her eyes darted towards the far end of the corridor, where the shadows deepened into impenetrable blackness near the emergency stairwell. A profound, unsettling feeling settled over her, the distinct impression of someone standing in that hidden corner, just out of sight, observing her, waiting. The silence that followed was more profound than any she had ever known, a crushing void where the city's distant sounds seemed to vanish. Goosebumps erupted on her arms. A primal fear, cold and sharp, coiled in her stomach. She slammed the door shut, the sound echoing loudly in the sudden quiet of her apartment. The click of the lock was a small, inadequate comfort. She leaned against the door, pressing her ear to the cold wood, listening intently. Nothing, only the frantic thumping of her own heart. The rest of the night was spent in a state of suspended animation, every shadow a potential threat, every creak of the old building amplified into a monstrous sound. She did not sleep again. The incident gnawed at her, a persistent splinter in her peace of mind. Was it a prank? A drunk neighbor? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion? Her rational mind scrambled for answers, but the chilling certainty of those 3 precise knocks and the profound empty darkness of the hallway defied explanation. The next night, it happened again, exactly at Baza a.m. Knock, knock, knock. This time, she didn't open the door. She lay rigid in her bed, blankets pulled up to her chin, listening to the relentless, precise rhythm. And the night after that, and the night after that. Every single night, without fail, the 3 knocks echoed through her apartment, a chilling, punctual reminder of something unseen, something waiting just beyond her door. Her sleep became a fractured landscape of dread, and the 9th floor, once merely an address, began to feel like a cage. The ritual of the 3 knocks, precise and unyielding, became the unwelcome cadence of Anne's nights. Sleep, once a sanctuary, was now a fragile truce, easily shattered. She'd lie awake, rigid beneath her blankets, listening to the rhythmic assault on her door, her breath held captive in her chest. Each knock, knock, knock was a chisel chipping away at her sanity, leaving her exhausted and perpetually on edge. The days blurred into a haze of fatigue, her office work suffering, her cheerful demeanor replaced by a hollow-eyed weariness. The quiet hum of the building, once comforting, now felt like a predatory whisper, constantly reminding her of the unseen presence that visited her door with such chilling punctuality. Her rational mind, a diligent companion in her waking hours, worked tirelessly to find an explanation. A recurring dream? A warped pipe system? But the knocks were too clear, too distinct, too real. She'd press her ear to the keyhole, her breath fogging the cold metal, but all she ever saw was the desolate stretch of the hallway, bathed in the sickly yellow of the flickering fluorescent light. Empty, always empty. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted, a cold phantom touch on her skin. Desperation gnawed at her, compelling her to act. One afternoon, after another night spent staring at the ceiling, Anne ordered a small, wireless security camera online. It arrived 2 days later, a discreet device she carefully mounted just above her doorframe. Its lens angled perfectly to capture anyone apartment 903. This, she thought, would expose the prankster, shatter the illusion, and restore the fragile peace she craved. She connected it to her phone, adjusting settings, her fingers trembling slightly with a mix of hope and apprehension. The first week of recordings yielded nothing but the occasional passing neighbor or the building's cleaner. Anne began to feel a sliver of relief, attributing the earlier incidents to her own overactive imagination. Perhaps the camera had scared them off. But then, on the 8th morning after its installation, a notification popped up on her phone. Motion detected at buzzer AM. Her heart leaped into her throat. She tapped a notification, her thumb hovering over the play button, a knot tightening in her stomach. The video played. The hallway was dark, the camera's infrared vision painting the scene in stark monochrome. Then a shadow emerged. Not a person, not a form she could identify, but a dense, inky blackness that seemed to materialize from the very fabric of the air, right up against her door. It was impossibly close to the lens, distorting the image, making it appear stretched and warped. Her breath hitched. She watched, horrified, as the shadow lingered for a long moment, a shapeless mass devoid of any discernible features. And then it simply vanished, melting back into the darkness from which it had come. Anne rewound the footage, replayed it, again and again. There were no legs. The shadow simply hovered, solid yet formless, a terrifying blot against the mundane backdrop of her doorway. No feet touched the floor. It was a floating void. The camera, she realized, had merely confirmed her darkest fears. The rational explanations crumbled, leaving behind a gaping chasm of the unknown. That same morning, as she stepped out for work, another disturbing detail presented itself. Just beneath her front door, a thin, glistening trail of water snaked across the linoleum, ending abruptly at the edge of her welcome mat. It was a small detail, easily overlooked, but for Anne, it was a terrifying confirmation. It looked exactly like someone, soaking wet, had been standing there for an extended period, the water slowly dripping from their clothes onto the floor. Who or what? The questions pounded in her head, echoing the relentless knocks. Her interactions with the building staff became strained. Zung, the building's security guard, a man whose usual joviality seemed to evaporate whenever the 9th floor was mentioned, offered no comfort. When Anne cautiously brought up the strange happenings, he would mumble something about old pipes or the wind, his eyes consistently avoiding hers, his gaze flicking nervously towards the ceiling. He seemed to carry a burden, a silent knowledge he refused to share, his reluctance only deepening Anne's unease. He maintained a diligent presence on the lower floors, but Anne noticed he rarely, if ever, patrolled the 9th floor after midnight. It was an unspoken truth, a quiet rule that defined his nightly routine. One afternoon, returning from a particularly grueling day, Anne found herself sharing the elevator with an elderly resident from a lower floor. Lost in thought, she pressed the button for her floor, 9. The doors whirred shut and the elevator began its ascent. But instead of stopping at 9, it continued, a faint, metallic groan accompanying its unexpected climb. The display panel, a small, unforgiving rectangle of light, flickered past 8, then 9, and then, to Anne's utter bewilderment, illuminated 10. Her eyes widened in disbelief. The building only had 9 floors. There was no 10th. A sudden sharp lurch brought the elevator to a complete halt. The lights inside flickered once, plunging the cabin into momentary darkness before sputtering back to life. The doors, however, remained resolutely shut. A heavy silence descended, broken only by the frantic pounding of Anne's heart. She stared at the 10 on the panel, then at the unresponsive door, a cold dread seeping into her bones. The elderly woman beside her, oblivious, simply pressed 9 again, her brow furrowed in mild annoyance. As if her touch had broken a spell, the elevator groaned, descended a single floor, and finally, with a soft chime, opened onto the familiar, dimly lit corridor of the 9th floor. Anne stumbled out, her legs weak, leaving the bewildered old woman behind. The incident felt like a cruel trick, a tangible manifestation of the impossible, confirming that the anomalies of the 9th floor were not confined to the dark hours of 3 a.m., nor to the spectral figures captured by her camera. They permeated the very fabric of the building, reaching out to touch her in the most unsettling ways. The 9th floor was not just a place where strange things happened, it was a place where the rules of reality bent, a place where she was unequivocally trapped. The cumulative effect of the nightly knocks, the legless shadow, the unexplained water trail, and the phantom 10th floor began to wear on Anne's resolve. Her apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a stage set for a terrifying, invisible play.
Every shadow held a potential secret. Every creak of the old building sent shivers down her spine. The outside world offered little respite. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, convinced that the eerie presence of the 9th floor might somehow follow her into the daylight. The sense of isolation grew, a heavy blanket smothering her. She felt like a character in a story she didn't understand, trapped by circumstances she couldn't control. One blustery afternoon, as Anne was fumbling with her keys at her door, a gentle cough startled her. She turned to find Baluan, an elderly woman with sharp, knowing eyes and hair pulled back in a neat bun, standing a few feet away. Baluan lived just a few doors down, apartment 906, and was one of the few long-term residents Anne had seen on the 9th floor. She was a silent observer, often seen tending to a small potted plant in her window, her presence a quiet anchor in the otherwise unsettling environment.
Anne had always been a little intimidated by Baluan's reserved demeanor, but today there was an unusual urgency in her gaze. Anne, cháu có khỏe không? Baluan asked, her voice a soft murmur, barely above a whisper, as if afraid of being overheard by the very walls. Her question, though seemingly polite, carried a deeper undercurrent of concern. Anne's worn-out appearance certainly spoke volumes. Anne offered a tired smile, a weak attempt to mask the turmoil within. Cháu vẫn khỏe, bà Loan, cảm ơn bà. Bà Loan stepped closer, her eyes scanning the empty corridor before settling back on Anne. Her expression was solemn, her lips pressed into a thin line. Ta cần nói chuyện với cháu một lát, she said, her voice dropping even lower, her hand gently touching Anne's arm. The touch was cool, almost ethereal. Anne nodded, a sudden hope flickering within her. Perhaps Baluan knew something that could cut through the suffocating mystery. They moved inside Anne's apartment, the heavy door closing behind them with a soft thud that felt oddly final. Baluan sat on the edge of Anne's sofa, her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze unwavering. The air in the room seemed to thicken with unspoken weight. Anne sat opposite her, her heart thrumming with anticipation. Anne, Baluan began, her voice a hushed whisper that forced Anne to lean in. Cháu đã nghe thấy tiếng gõ, đúng không? It wasn't a question, but a statement imbued with an undeniable certainty. Anne's breath got in her throat. She could only nod, her mind reeling. Baluan knew. She truly knew. Ta đã sống ở đây hơn 10 năm rồi, Baluan continued, her gaze distant, as if recalling events from a far-off past. Ta đã thấy nhiều người đến rồi đi, đặc biệt là ở tầng này.
A heavy sigh escaped her lips. Những người mới đến, họ không biết, nhưng những người sống lâu năm thì biết. She paused, her eyes meeting Anne's, a profound warning etched into their depths. Nếu cháu nghe 3 tiếng gõ, đừng trả lời. Tuyệt đối đừng mở cửa. Anne felt a cold tremor run through her. The clarity of the warning, coming from someone who had witnessed the building's hidden history, struck her with an undeniable force. Nhưng, tại sao, bà? She managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. Bà Loan shook her head slowly, her expression grave. Nếu cháu nghe thấy giọng ai đó gọi tên cháu, càng không được mở. Bất kể là giọng ai, bất kể nó nói gì. Her words were stark, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Kẻ gõ cửa, nó không tìm cháu, nó tìm người từng mở cửa trước. The words hung in the air, chilling Anne to the bone. Người từng mở cửa trước, Anne repeated, a new layer of dread coiling in her stomach. What does that mean? What fate befell those who had answered the knocking? Bà Loan's face was a mask of sorrow and unspoken fear. Anne pressed for more, her voice trembling slightly. Tại sao lại không tìm cháu? Và nó tìm ai?
Bà Loan's gaze drifted towards the window, her eyes unfocused, as if seeing something beyond the grimy glass. A long silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the distant sounds of city life. When she finally spoke again, her voice was barely a breath. Tầng 9 này, từng có một cô gái, chết trong thang máy. Her voice cracked, a flicker of pain crossing her aged features. Đúng 3 giờ sáng. Anne gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. The elevator incident, the phantom 10th floor, rushed back with a horrifying clarity. A girl, dead in the elevator, at 3 a.m. The pieces, though scattered, began to form a terrifying mosaic. Chết như thế nào bà? Anne pressed, a desperate need for answers overriding her fear. Bà Loan flinched, her eyes widening slightly, as if the memory itself was a physical wound. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them, a profound weariness settling over her face. Ta không thể nói nhiều hơn, she whispered, her voice barely audible, tinged with a deep, almost ancient fear. Chỉ cần nhớ lời ta dặn, đừng bao giờ mở cửa. With that, she rose, her movements slow and deliberate. She walked to the door, her bike ramrod straight, and without another word, she let herself out, leaving Anne alone in the suddenly silent apartment, surrounded by the weight of her cryptic warning. The silence after Bà Loan's departure felt heavier, colder, permeated by the chilling image of a girl dying in the elevator at 3 a.m. Anne was left with more questions than answers, but one thing was abundantly clear. The 3 knocks were not just a nuisance, they were a prelude to something far more sinister. A deadly game of hide and seek where the only winning move was to remain hidden forever. And she was already a player. Bà Loan's cryptic warning, coupled with the chilling fragment of a girl dying in the elevator at 3 a.m., solidified Anne's terror. The 3 knocks were no longer just an unsettling anomaly. They were a harbinger, a spectral invitation to a doom she could only vaguely imagine. Sleep remained a distant luxury, replaced by restless hours spent staring at her door, listening, waiting. The apartment felt colder, the air heavier, as if the unshared history of the 9th floor had seeped into its very foundations. Anne's rational mind, usually her steadfast anchor, was now adrift in a sea of supernatural dread. She tried to resume her daily routines, but the world outside her apartment seemed dull, muted, disconnected from the vibrant fear that consumed her within. Colleagues noticed her increasingly gaunt appearance, her distracted gaze,
but she offered vague excuses about stress and long hours. How could she explain the legless shadow, the phantom flaw, the old woman's dire warnings? They would think her mad. The isolation deepened, a silent burden she carried alone. The urge to understand, to piece together the full narrative of the tragedy that haunted her floor, became an irresistible compulsion. Bà Loan had offered a tantalizing glimpse, a terrifying hint, but then retreated behind a wall of fear. Anne knew she couldn't press the elderly woman further. The answer, if it existed, lay elsewhere, perhaps buried in the neglected archives of the building's past. Her thoughts turned to Jung, the security guard. Despite his evasiveness regarding the 9th floor, he was the closest thing she had to an ally within the building's administration. He had access to the building's security systems, its hidden eyes and ears. Perhaps the camera footage, the raw, unfiltered truth, could finally provide the answers. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but the alternative was to remain in terrifying ignorance, a silent target of the 3 a.m. knocks. The next morning, fortified by an extra strong coffee and a resolve born of fear, Anne approached Jung in the lobby.
He was polishing the brass plate on the main entrance, his movements slow và methodical. When he saw her approaching, his shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. Chào anh Dũng, Anne began, trying to keep her voice steady. Tôi muốn nhờ anh một việc. Dũng turned, his smile strained, his eyes still avoiding hers. Có chuyện gì vậy, cô Anne? Anne hesitated, then took a deep breath. Liên quan đến camera giám sát, she said, cutting straight to the point. Tôi muốn xem lại đoạn phim cũ của tầng 9, đặc biệt là khoảng 3 năm trước. She watched his face carefully. At the mention of tầng 9 và 3 năm trước, Dũng easygoing demeanor vanished. His face paled slightly, and his hands, which had been deftly polishing, stilled. Camera tầng 9, Dũng repeated, his voice tight. Phim cũ thì sao cô lại muốn xem? He fidgeted, his gaze flicking nervously towards the elevator. Anne met his gaze directly, her own eyes pleading. Tôi cần biết, anh Dũng. Có chuyện gì đó đang xảy ra ở tầng 9, và tôi nghĩ nó liên quan đến những gì đã xảy ra trước đây. Bà Loan, bà ấy đã kể cho tôi một chút. The mansion của bà Loan seemed to break through his reluctance, a key unlocking a hidden door. Dũng sighed, a heavy sound filled with resignation. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. Cô Anna, he began, his voice barely a whisper. Có những chuyện không nên biết đâu, để yên cho nó. Không thể để yên được anh Dũng, Anne insisted, her voice firm. Mỗi đêm tôi đều nghe thấy tiếng gõ. Tôi thấy những thứ không thể giải thích. Tôi cần phải hiểu chuyện gì đã xảy ra. Dũng looked at her then, a deep, troubled sadness in his eyes. He must have seen the genuine fear, the desperate need for answers etched onto her face. He hesitated for another long moment, weighing his options. Finally, with another weary sigh, he nodded. Được rồi, he said, his voice barely audible. Nhưng chỉ một lần thôi cô Anne, và đừng kể cho ai khác biết. He led her to a small, cluttered office tucked away in the building's basement, a forgotten space filled with outdated equipment and a faint smell of mildew. The air was thick with dust and the hum of old machinery. He fired up a dusty computer, its screen flickering to life with a kaleidoscope of grainy surveillance feeds. Zung navigated through the archaic software, his fingers moving with a practiced slowness until he found the archives for the 9th floor. Chúng ta sẽ xem khoảng thời gian mà bà Loan nhắc tới, Dũng said, his voice grim. Đây là ngày, đây rồi. He clicked on a video from 3 years ago. The screen filled with the familiar, dimly lit corridor of the 9th floor, rendered in the stark, unforgiving monochrome of the old camera. The timestamp in the corner confirmed it, 3 giờ. Anne leaned forward, her heart hammering against her ribs.
The footage began, a silent, grainy tableau. Suddenly, a figure burst into view.
A young woman, clearly in a state of extreme panic, ran down the hallway. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes disarrayed. Her face, though blurry, was contorted in terror. She was desperately, frantically pounding on the doors of the apartments as she ran, her arms a blur of motion. Though there was no sound on the old footage, Anne could almost hear her voice, a desperate, pleading cry. She could almost read the words forming on her lips. Cứu tôi, mở cửa làm ơn. Anne watched, horrified, as the girl reached apartment 906, then 903, Anne's own apartment. She hammered on the door, then moved on, her panicked eyes darting back and forth, searching for an open door, a sympathetic face, any sign of help. But the doors remained shut, unyielding, silent witnesses to her escalating terror. No one opened. The silence of the residence was deafening, even in the absence of sound. The girl continued her frantic, desperate dash, her movements becoming more erratic, her strength seemingly failing. She stumbled, falling to her knees near the elevator, her body trembling with fear and exhaustion. Anne's breath got in her throat. This was it? The elevator! Just as the girl collapsed, the elevator doors, without any visible prompt, but began to slide open, slowly, silently. But unlike normal, the inside of the elevator was not illuminated. It was a void, an impenetrable darkness, swallowing the light from the hallway. Anne gasped, her hands flying to mouth. The girl on the screen, paralyzed by fear or exhaustion, could only stare into the abyss. Then, from within that inky blackness, something moved, something unseen, but its presence undeniable. Anne watched, her blood turning to ice, as the girl's body was suddenly, violently yanked forward. She didn't struggle, didn't scream. She was simply pulled, like a puppet on an invisible string, into the suffocating darkness of the elevator shaft. The doors, with a slow, deliberate whir, slid shut, sealing her fate, her silent terror. And then, the video feed erupted into static. A furious blizzard of white noise and distorted lies consumed the screen. It was as if the camera itself had recoiled from the horror it had witnessed, hoặc as if the entity that had taken the girl had somehow corrupted the very signal. Dũng, his face ashen, quickly shut down the monitor. The silence in the small office was thick with the weight of the unspeakable. Anne felt a cold wave of nausea wash over her. The image of the girl pulled into the darkness burned in her mind. Kể từ hôm đó, Dũng finally said, his voice hoarse, tiếng gõ lúc 3 giờ sáng bắt đầu, luôn luôn, không ngừng. He looked at Anne, his eyes filled with a profound despair. Nó không phải là ống nước cô Anne, nó là cô ấy. The words hung in the stale air, a terrifying confirmation of Anne's worst nightmares. The knocks were not a prank, they were a plea, or something far, far worse. The grainy footage of the girl being dragged into the elevator's abyss branded itself onto Anne's memory, a horrifying loop that played ceaselessly in her mind. Dũng words, "It's her," echoed with a chilling finality, confirming the supernatural nature of her torment. The 3 a.m. knocks were no longer just a source of fear. They were a ghostly echo, a spectral plea from the trapped girl. Anne felt a profound, suffocating sense of helplessness. The knowledge she had sought so desperately had only deepened the terrifying mystery, replacing vague dread with a concrete, visceral horror. Returning to her apartment felt different now. Every shadow in the hallway seemed to lengthen. Every quiet creak of the building became the whisper of the unseen. The camera, once a tool of investigation, now felt like a silent, terrified witness, its infrared eye recording the endless vigil of a restless spirit. The water trail under her door, the legless shadow, the elevator's phantom ascent, all coalesced into a terrifying tapestry of the impossible. Anne's world had fractured, the mundane reality she once inhabited now replaced by a chilling supernatural truth. The image of the girl frantically knocking on doors, begging for help, haunted Anne most. The residents, safe behind their locked doors, had remained silent. They had been warned, perhaps, or simply too afraid. Anne understood that fear now, a cold, paralyzing force that threatened to consume her. Would she have opened her door had she been there 3 years ago? The question gnawed at her conscience, adding a layer of guilt to her terror. The nights became an agonizing waiting game. Anne lay awake, her senses hyper-alert, anticipating the inevitable. The clock's steady march towards 3 a.m. was a torturous countdown.
When the 3 knocks came, they were no longer a surprise, but a confirmation, a renewed assertion of the entity's presence. She would close her eyes tightly, willing herself to disappear, to become invisible, her heart bounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Her conversation with Zung had been brief after the video, a shared, silent understanding of the horror they had witnessed. He had extracted a promise from her not to speak of it, a promise Anne easily gave. Some truths were too dangerous to share. He seemed to carry the weight of the 9th floor's history, a silent guardian of a dark secret. He continued his patrols, though Anne noted his continued avoidance of the 9th floor corridor after dark. His fear was palpable, a testament to the power of the entity that haunted their building. Anne tried to research similar incidents, scouring old news articles and online forums, looking for any mention of unexplained deaths or disappearances in old apartment buildings. She found whispers of urban legends, tales of restless spirits and haunted residences, but nothing concrete that matched the specifics or her situation. The 9-story building, the 3 a.m. knocks, the trapped girl, it was a unique horror, hers alone to bear. One evening, a week after seeing the footage, Anne found a small handwritten note tucked under her door. Her hand trembled as she picked it up. The handwriting was neat, elegant, distinctly Ba Loan. It simply read, "Cháu An, đêm nay đừng ngủ, hãy sẵn sàng." A cold dread seeped into Anne's bones. Don't sleep, be ready. Ready for what? The knocks were always the same, always 3. But Ba Loan's note implied a change, an escalation. Anne spent the evening in a state of heightened anxiety, her apartment lights blazing, a faint tremor running through her. She tried to distract herself with a book, but her eyes merely scanned the words without comprehension. Every shadow seemed to deepen. Every mundane sound of the old building took on a sinister edge. As the clock gripped the hard 3 a.m., Anne felt an unprecedented tension in the air, a thick, suffocating stillness that settled over the entire floor. The usual distant city hum seemed to vanish, replaced by an unnatural quiet. Her heart hammered in her chest, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. She gripped a small, heavy ceramic vase, her only potential weapon, her knuckles white. A foolish gesture, she knew, against something that wasn't flesh and blood, but a futile attempt to regain some semblance of control. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed 2:59 a.m. Anne held her breath, her eyes fixed on the door, her ears straining for the familiar sound. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, the clock flipped to 3 a.m. The sound came, but it wasn't 3 knocks. It was 9. Knock, 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 knock. They were frantic, desperate, a chaotic assault on her door, utterly unlike the precise, rhythmic trio she had grown accustomed to. It sounded like someone was throwing the entire body against the wood, a desperate, rapid-fire plea. The sound was not just loud, but imbued with a raw, agonizing urgency, as if someone was trapped, in dire need of help, pleading with every ounce of their being. It was the sound of utter despair, of a soul at the precipice of oblivion, mirroring the frantic knocking of the girl in the video. Anne gasped, her hands shaking uncontrollably. This was what Balon had warned her about. This wasn't the familiar, chilling routine. This was something new, something terrifyingly different. The intensity of the knocking was overwhelming, a physical assault on her senses. It filled the entire apartment, vibrating through the floorboards, rattling the very foundations of her sanity. Then, as abruptly as it began, the 9 frantic knocks ceased.
The sudden silence that followed was even more deafening than the cacophony that preceded it. Anne stood frozen, clutching the ceramic vase, her breath ragged. She strained her ears, listening to the heavy quiet, the profound stillness that seemed to press in on her from all sides. And then, from just beyond her door, a new sound emerged. A whisper, a voice. Anne. It was soft, barely audible, yet it resonated deep within her. It was a woman's voice, imbued with a chilling sorrow. Anne, mở cửa cho tôi với. Anne, open the door for me. The words, spoken in her native tongue, pierced through her terror, not just because they were a direct appeal, but because the voice was undeniably, unmistakably hers. It was her voice, a perfect, chilling imitation, modulated with a desperate plea. Anne's blood ran cold. Her own voice, pleading with her to open the door. It was the ultimate violation, a horrifying mimicry designed to break her resolve. She was paralyzed, her mind screaming a silent no, even as a part of her wondered how such a thing was possible. The entity knew her name, it could imitate her voice. It was learning, and it wanted in. The sound of her own voice, twisted into a desperate plea from beyond her door, shattered Anne's last vestiges of composure. Her entire body stiffened, a statue carved from pure terror. The ceramic vase slipped from her numb fingers, clattering softly onto the floor, a mundane sound swallowed by the suffocating dread. Every fiber of her being screamed to retreat, to vanish, to somehow unhear what she had just heard. It was not merely a voice, it was an intimate violation, a chilling echo of her own identity turned against her. The entity knew her, it knew her name, it could mimic her, a terrifying display of its growing power. Anne, open the door for me? The words replayed in her mind, a relentless loop of her own voice begging for release, or perhaps for entry.
Balon's warning thundered in her ears. If you hear anyone call your name, absolutely do not open the door. Anne đã understand the warning intellectually, but experiencing it, hearing her own voice twisted into such a sinister invitation, was a different magnitude of horror. Her throat constricted, her lungs burning, unable to draw a full breath. Then the lights in her apartment flickered, once, twice, and then, with a soft pop, they died completely. The room plunged into absolute darkness, a profound, inky blackness that seemed to press in on her, stealing the air. Anne gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. The sudden loss of light was disorienting, amplifying her fear, stripping away the last illusion of safety. She fumbles blindly in the dark, her hands shaking, reaching for her phone, for any source of light, any anchor in the terrifying void. A new sound emerged from the darkness, a soft, almost imperceptible tremor.
It was the sound of her front door, specifically the doorknob. It began to turn, slowly, deliberately, a faint metallic squeak accompanying its rotation. Anne froze,
her eyes wide open in the oppressive darkness, straining to see. She could hear it, she could feel it, an unseen hand attempting to unlock her door, to breach the final barrier between them. The sound was methodical, patient, utterly terrifying. It was not a struggle, not a force. It was a calculated, insidious attempt to gain entry. A cold, wet draft snaked its way under the door, carrying with it a faint, cloying scent, something akin to stagnant water mixed with an indefinable sweetness, like decay. Anne stumbled backward, her hand reaching out blindly for something, anything to steady herself. Her fingers brushed against the cold, smooth surface of a wall. She pressed herself against it, her entire body rigid, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps.
From the tin gap at the bottom of her door, where the wet draft had originated, a sliver of darkness moved. It was not merely a shadow, but something tangible. A pale, bluish-white form began to slowly, agonizingly snake its way through the narrow crevice. Anne stared, mesmerized and horrified, as a hand, impossibly thin and translucent, with long, slender fingers, elongated and unnatural, began to slide through. It was not an illusion, it was real. A spectral hand, dripping with an unseen liquid, reaching into her home. The sight broke her paralysis. A surge of primal terror coursed through her, overriding everything else. She didn't think, she reacted. She turned and bolted, her bare feet pounding on the dark floor, stumbling over unseen obstacles. Her destination was the bathroom, the only other room with a lock, a desperate attempt to find a final refuge. She burst into the small, cramped space, slamming the door shut behind her with a desperate force. Her fingers fumbled wildly for the deadbolt, her hand shaking so violently she could barely grasp the small metal latch. With a frantic click, the bolt slid into place, a meager barrier against the creeping horror. She leaned against the door, panting, her chest heaving, listening to the pounding of her own heart in her ears. Then, with another desperate lunge, she slapped at the light switch. The fluorescent light above her head flickered on, bathing the small bathroom in its harsh, unforgiving glow. The sudden illumination was a temporary reprieve, a fragile shield against the oppressive darkness of the apartment beyond. Anne sagged against the door, her eyes squeezed shut, trying to regain control of her ragged breathing. When she opened her eyes, they immediately fell upon the bathroom mirror. It was old, streaked with remnants of toothpaste and water stains. But now, it was inexplicably fogged over, completely opaque, as if someone had just taken a scalding hot shower in the otherwise courtroom. A fresh wave of dread washed over her. She hadn't used the shower. The mirror should have been clear. As she watched, the condensation on the mirror began to move, not in random patterns, but as if an invisible finger was slowly, deliberately, drawing across the surface. A message began to form, its ghostly letters appearing one by one, chillingly clear against the misted glass. Đừng lặp lại sai lầm của họ. Don't repeat their mistake. The message solidified on the mirror, the unseen hand's warning echoing Ba Luan's earlier words, solidifying the connection between the current horror and the past tragedy. Their mistake. The mistake of the residents who had left the girl to her fate. The mistake of opening the door. Anne stared at the words, her mind reeling, a terrifying clarity washing over her. The entity was not merely haunting, it was communicating. It was warning her. Or was it something else? A cruel psychological game. The fear in the small bathroom was almost a tangible presence, pressing in on her from all sides. The light above flickered ominously, threatening to plunge her back into darkness. The doorknob to the bathroom, she noticed with a jolt, was slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to turn.
The faint, wet smell from the hallway seemed to seep through the tiny gaps around the doorframe. She was trapped. Trapped with a chilling message on the mirror and something unspeakable trying to get in. The truth, whatever it was closing in, and she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The bathroom, meant to be a refuge, was now a claustrophobic cage. Anne stood transfixed, staring at the message on the mirror. Don't repeat their mistake. Her mind a chaotic storm of fear and fragments of information. The doorknob behind her rattled gently, a chilling reminder of the entity's relentless pursuit. She was trapped between a spectral warning, a physical manifestation of horror. The cold, wet smell from beyond the bathroom door intensified, confirming the presence of the spectral hand, the one that had slithered through the crack of her apartment door. Her phone, still clutched in her trembling hand, suddenly buzzed. The vibration startled her, nearly making her drop it. A call from Baluan. Hope, fragile but potent, surged through her. A connection to the outside, a voice of reason in the maelstrom of terror. She fumbled with the screen, her fingers numb, and answered, pressing the phone to her ear. Anne, cháu có nghe phải không? Baluan's voice was a ragged whisper, laced with panic, her breathing ragged, as if she had just run a great distance. Nó không phải tìm người giúp, nó tìm người thay thế. The words struck Anne like a physical blow. It's not looking for help. It's looking for a replacement. The meaning clicked into place with horrifying clarity, twisting everything she thought she knew. The frantic knocks, the pleading voice. It wasn't a desperate cry for salvation. It was a sinister lure. The girl in the video, pounding on doors, crying for help, had been the initial victim. But the entity wasn't a victim. It was a hunter, seeking its next prey. Nhiều năm trước, bà Loan continue, her voice breaking. Cư dân tầng này từng nghe tiếng gõ của cô gái gặp nạn. Một người đàn ông đã mở cửa. Hắn tưởng là người say, muốn giúp đỡ. A wave of nausea washed over Anne. The innocent act of kindness, born of human compassion, had been a fatal error. The man, like the girl, had become a victim. Sau đêm đó, bà Loan whispered, her voice barely audible. Người đàn ông biến mất không dấu vết, không ai tìm thấy hắn, cảnh sát cũng không tìm ra. The chilling truth laid bare. The entity didn't just haunt, it consumed, it took. And it started with the one who opened the door. Và tiếng gõ tiếp tục, luôn tìm kẻ tiếp theo mở cửa. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, forming a complete, terrifying picture. The 9th floor was a hunting ground, and the knocks were its call. The girl, once alive and terrified, had been dragged into the elevator. Then, after someone opened their door, that person had disappeared, presumably taken in the same manner. And now, the knocking had moved to Anne's door. The entity wasn't just searching for a replacement, it was searching for its replacement. Someone to take its place in the perpetual cycle of the hunt, while it, perhaps, found its own terrifying freedom. The message on the mirror, "Don't repeat their mistake," now held a double meaning. It wasn't just a warning about the initial tragedy, but a warning about the man who had opened the door. The entity had been trapped, perhaps by its own fate in the elevator, and needed someone to take its place. Every time a door opened, it found a new substitute, condemning the compassionate or the foolish to its own terrifying existence. The phone line crackled, and Baluan's voice came through again, weaker now, laced with a new urgency. Anh, cháu phải giữ vững, đừng để nó vào, vì nếu cháu mở, cháu sẽ là người thay thế. A loud, violent thump vibrated through the bathroom door, rattling the frame. Anne cried out, clutching the phone tightly. The doorknob began to turn more forcefully, a frantic twisting, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very wood. The wet, decaying smell intensified, flooding the small space. Not biết cháu ở trong đó, bà Loan shrieked, her voice a desperate, dying plea. Anne, cố lên! And then the call disconnected. The line went dead, leaving Anne in the suffocating silence of the bathroom, broken only by the aggressive rattling of the door and the pounding of her own heart. The glow of a phone screen suddenly flickered, then died, plunging the bathroom into complete darkness once more. The fluorescent light above, which had offered a fragile sense of safety, sputtered and died with a final mournful hum. Anne was plunged into a terrifying void. The air grew impossibly cold, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into her very marrow. It felt as though a frozen breath was being exhaled directly onto her, emanating from the mirror. In the profound darkness, the message, "Don't repeat their mistake," seemed to glow faintly, an eerie, phosphorescent green, before fading into invisibility. The doorknob to the bathroom was now twisting violently, the old wood groaning under the assault. The faint sound of water dripping, the same sound she'd heard under her main apartment door, now seemed to be coming from inside the bathroom. And then a gust of frigid air, sharp and biting, swept over her, originating from the mirror, as if a portal had opened within its reflective surface. A low, guttural whisper, deep and resonant, filled the small, dark space. It was not her voice this time. It was a voice filled with ancient malice, a voice that seemed to vibrate from the very depths of the building itself. "Lần này, đến lượt mày mở. This time, it's your turn to open." The words hung in the frigid air, a chilling prophecy, a direct command. Anne stumbled backward, bumping against the cold, tiled wall. Her legs gave out, and she slid to the floor, collapsing in a heap, her hands pressed against her ears, trying to block out the horrifying sound. The doorknob twisted again, more violently, as if a great force was trying to wrench it free. The sound of dripping water was closer now, seeming to echo directly from the mirror itself. The cold from the mirror intensified, a terrifying, tangible presence. Anne was trapped, helpless, facing a choice that would determine her fate, and perhaps the fate of others on the 9th floor. The cycle was demanding its next participant, and it had chosen her. The ancient, guttural voice from the darkness demanding, "This time, it's your turn to open," reverberated through Anne's very core. Her body was a leaden weight pinned to the cold bathroom floor, every muscle rigid with terror. The doorknob continued its frantic dance, a metallic symphony of impending doom. The frigid gust of wind from the mirror now swirled around her, carrying the scent of damp earth and something acrid, almost metallic, like old blood. The dripping water sound intensified, a relentless, rhythmic drip, drip, drip that seemed to originate from the mirror itself, as if the glass had become a leaking conduit to another realm. Panic, cold and absolute, threatened to consume her. Her mind raced, desperately seeking an escape, a solution, anything to counter the overwhelming presence pressing in from all sides. But there was nowhere to go. The small bathroom, once a symbol of last resort safety, was now her tomb, a stage set for her final horrifying choice. The words of Ballon, fragmented and desperate, echoed in her memory. It's not looking for help, it's looking for a replacement. And the message on the mirror, "Don't repeat their mistake." the mistake of opening the door. Anne squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the darkness, the sounds, the creeping cold. But the voice, so deep and resonant, seemed to penetrate her very thoughts, a direct assault on her consciousness. It was a voice that belonged to no living thing, ancient and filled with a profound, terrifying hunger. Her phone, dead and useless, lay on the floor beside her. The connection to Ballon, her last link to a semblance of sanity, was severed. Was Ballon safe? Or had the entity somehow reached her, silencing her before she could offer further warning? A pang of desperate worry for the old woman pierced through Anne's terror. She pictured Ballon, frail yet defiant, her knowing eyes filled with a fear that now Anne understood completely. The doorknob's frantic twisting suddenly stopped. The abrupt silence was almost more terrifying than the cacophony. Anne held her breath, her eyes still squeezed shut, bracing herself for whatever would come next. The dripping water continued, a relentless counterpoint to the thrumming fear in her ears. Then a new sound began, soft at first, then growing louder, more distinct. It was a scraping, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor in the apartment outside. It moved slowly, deliberately, getting closer to the bathroom door. Anne's imagination conjured horrifying images, the legless shadow, now tangible, dragging itself towards her, its formless mass scraping against the linoleum. The sound was sickening, a sound of struggle, of immense effort. The scraping stopped directly outside the bathroom door. A pause, a heavy, expectant silence, and then a new sound, a low, mournful moan, filled the unimaginable sorrow and pain. It was a woman's moan, thin and reedy, but utterly devoid of humanity. It twisted Anne's stomach into knots. This was not her voice. This was the girl's voice. The girl from the video, trapped, tormented, moaning just inches away. Cứu tôi, Anne. The words were broken, guttural, barely articulated, but the plea was clear. It was the girl, using Anne's name, echoing the video, drawing her in. Anne pressed her palms harder against her ears, trying to shut it out. It was a trick. She knew it was a trick. The entity was clever, insidious, playing on her empathy, her humanity. It wasn't the girl, it was the hunter. It wanted her to open the door, to repeat the mistake of the man before. But the moan, the desperate, broken plea was so convincing. What if unwin the girl? What if she truly was trapped, suffering, right outside the door, and needed Anne's help? The thought was a torment. Her conscience, her inherent human instinct to aid the distressed, warred with the dire warnings, with the terrifying knowledge that opening the door meant her own doom. The dripping from the mirror was now a steady stream, forming a small puddle on the tiled floor at her feet. The frigid air blowing from it intensified, swirling around her, making her teeth chatter uncontrollably. She could hear the sound of the stream growing, pooling, spreading across the cold tiles. Then, from the darkness outside the door, a loud, piercing shriek ripped through the air. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, a sound that transcended the human, echoing with ancient pain and terror. The shriek was so intense, so raw, that Anne felt a searing pain behind her eyes, her eardrums throbbing. It was the shriek of the girl from the video, but magnified 1,000-fold. A final, despairing cry before being dragged into the abyss. The shriek abruptly cut off, replaced by the same low, guttural growl she had heard earlier, now amplified, menacing. It was followed by the wet, dragging sound again, but this time it was receding, moving away from the bathroom door, back towards the apartment's entrance. The entity was withdrawing, for now. Anne remained huddled on the floor, trembling violently, gasping for breath, the after-image of the shriek burning in her mind. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, broken only by the relentless drip, drip, drip from the mirror and the sound of her own ragged breathing. As her eyes adjusted slightly to the profound darkness, she noticed a faint, shimmering light emanating from the mirror. It was not the message again. It was a swirling, vortex-like mist deep within the glass, like looking into a dark, disturbed pool of water.
And from within that swirling mist, two pinpricks of light, red and malevolent, seemed to coalesce, staring directly at her. They were eyes, watching her, waiting. The cold emanating from the mirror was now unbearable, turning the small bathroom into an ice chamber. The water puddle at her feet was growing, creeping slowly towards her, its surface reflecting the faint red glow of the eyes in the mirror. She was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to break contact with the terrifying gaze from within the glass. The ancient voice, now a mere whisper, slithered into her mind, not through her ears, but directly into her thoughts. Don't ni, chow sedilk ku, chum I zik chow dao. Don't think you will be saved. No one will help you. The whisper was chilling, utterly devoid of emotion, a pronouncement of her utter isolation. It was a statement of fact, confirming her worst fears. No help was coming.
No one would open their door for her, just as they had not opened their doors for the girl. Anne was alone, trapped between the entity in the apartment and the menacing reflection in the mirror, her fate hang by a thread, waiting for the final, inevitable act to unfold. The only remaining question was not if the entity would come for her, but when and how she would meet her end. The terror was absolute. The malevolent whisper, "Don't think, you will be saved, no one will help you," echoed in Anne's mind, a chilling pronouncement from the depths of the mirror. She was an anchor in a sea of despair, utterly alone, the profound darkness of the bathroom pressing in on her, its cold an extension of the entity's presence. The red pinpricks of light in the swirling mist of the mirror held her captive, their gaze a tangible weight on her soul. The dripping water, now a small stream, had reached her feet, its icy touch a horrifying sensation. Her world has shrank to this tiny, dark space, a final stand against an unseen, unstoppable force. Her heart pounded a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs, a desperate drumbeat in the silence. The earlier scraping sounds, the shriek, the guttural growl, they had subsided, leaving only the relentless drip and the pervasive cold. It was a moment of terrifying lull, a hunter toying with its prey before the final strike. Anne tried to breathe, to find some semblance of control, but her lungs felt constricted, her body rigid. She closed her eyes, attempting to conjure an image of sunlight, of her office, of anything to counteract the suffocating darkness. But the image of the girl being dragged into the elevator, of the spectral hand, of her own voice pleading, overwhelmed her. The horror was complete, inescapable. Then, from outside the bathroom door, it began again. The sound was soft at first, so faint she almost missed it. Knock. One single knock. Slow, deliberate, echoing in the profound silence. Anne's eyes snapped open, her gaze still fixed on the red eyes in the mirror. They seemed to glow brighter, pulsing with an inner light, anticipating. A long pause, a breath held hostage in the frigid air. Then, again. Knock. 2 knocks now, each one a precise, measured beat against the wood, utterly devoid of the frantic desperation of earlier. This was a different kind of sound, a sound of unyielding patience, of inevitability. It was the original sound, the 3 knocks that had first welcomed her to the 9th floor, returning, simplified, focused. Another interminable pause, stretching time into an agonizing eternity. The red eyes in the mirror seemed to gleam with a triumphant, ancient malevolence. And then the final, chilling sound. Knock. 3 knocks. The ritual was complete. The original pattern, the chilling invitation that started it all, had returned.
It was a reassertion of its timeless presence, a declaration that the game had come full circle. Anne felt a cold wave of resignation wash over her. This was the final act. The doorknob to the bathroom, which had ceased its violent twisting, now began to turn again, slowly, gently, as if it were being turned by a curious, unseen child. The soft click of the lock, the very lock she had so desperately secured, echoed loudly in the small space. It had yielded. Her last physical barrier had fallen. Anne tried to push herself up, to run, to scream, but her limbs refused to obey. She was frozen, a terrified observer of her own impending doom. The frigid air from the mirror intensified, swirling around her like a ghostly shroud, carrying with it the undeniable scent of stagnant water and deep, cold earth. The red eyes in the mirror expanded, filling the glass, becoming 2 terrifying glowing orbs, consuming her reflection, consuming everything. From the now unlocked bathroom door, a new, wet sound emerged. A soft squish, 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 as something heavy and sodden began to move into the room. A darkness, deeper than the absence of light, began to coalesce in the doorway. A shapeless void that seemed to drink in the remaining faint glows. It was a presence, immense and suffocating, pushing into the small space. The air grew thick, unbreathable, filled with the scent of decay. The red eyes in the mirror pulsed with a silent, triumphant fury. The swirling mist within the glass intensified, becoming a vortex, pulling at the very fabric of the air, creating a tangible sense of suction. The water puddle at Anne's feet began to ripple, disturbed by an unseen force. The low, guttural voice, ancient and inescapable, filled the bathroom once more, not from the door, but from everywhere, from within her own head, from the very walls, from the mirror itself. It was the final, terrifying command, imbued with an undeniable power. A voice that resonated with the chill of countless forgotten nights. Lần này, đến lượt mày mở. The words hung in the icy air, a sentence, a decree, a chilling end. Anne could feel the presence of the entity filling the small bathroom, its unseen form pressing against her, the code overwhelming, consuming. Her vision blurred, her consciousness fading at the edges. The red eyes in the mirror were the last thing she saw, 2 burning embers of pure, unadulterated malevolence, pulling her in, demanding her surrender. The cycle was complete. The story ends here. Whether Anne survived or not, no one could say for certain. The apartment 903 remained empty for weeks, its door always locked, a silent testament to the horrors within. But a new chilling detail emerged from the quiet hum of the building. The security camera, diligently recording the mundane rhythms of apartment life, captured a subtle yet profound shift.
From the following night onward, precisely at Bazert, the familiar, precise knock, knock, knock was no longer heard at apartment 903. Instead, the chilling sound had moved. It now emanated with unwavering punctuality from the door of the apartment next door. The cycle continued, a whisper of dread, perpetually searching for its next participant, a timeless echo in the heart of the old city building.